Hello BookTube, it's Roz and it's time for a Scallydandle. We haven't done one of these videos for a few weeks, and that's the videos when I try to kind of take a look at a book from perhaps a country where most of us don't regularly read things from, or certainly from not England or the States, you know, the sort of mainstream kind of like fare that we many of us devour most of the time. And today it's one of the times when I'm talking about a book by an author who's from a country where I've never read a book from that place before, and that today is Suriname. And the book is The Cost of Sugar by Cynthia MacLeod. Now, I'm going to say a little bit about Suriname because I have to say it's not a place that I knew much about till I read this book. And having read this book, which is historical fiction, I know quite a lot more. And but I'm guessing that unless you're from South America or the Caribbean, you may not know a whole load about Suriname either. Now, there's a thing. Why do I say South America or the Caribbean? That's because Suriname is on the north coast of the South American continent, facing onto the Caribbean Sea, and culturally it really has much closer links with the Caribbean than the rest of South America, along with the country either side. So you've got like Suriname in the middle. On one side of it is Guyana, what was British Guyana, and on the other side of it is French Guiana, and all three of them are kind of quite, more Caribbean perhaps in kind of culture. Suriname is the Dutch one. French Guiana is an odd place because it's one of those bits of France overseas. Like it's technically a French department, not a country. You know, it's legally part of France. The euro is their currency. There you go. But Suriname was a Dutch colony and became independent in 1975. But let's wind back a bit further. So Suriname's sort of indigenous original inhabitants were coastal peoples like the Arawaks and the Caribs, who were also in the Caribbean islands, if that makes sense. And then in the rainforest, sort of, which was actually covered the majority of Suriname, so sort of kind of to the south, and that now kind of links into the Amazonian rainforest in Brazil, if that makes sense. The people there were like lots of different ones, but like the Wayana and others. So they're the original inhabitants. Roll forward to the 16th century, you get the British, the Dutch, the French kind of coming and poking their fingers in, as we did. Now, and establishing plantations, and but Suriname wound up as a Dutch colony specifically because in the late 17th century, the British and the Dutch were kind of fighting various sort of wars and conflicts over their colonial possessions in that part of the world. And Suriname ended up as being exchanged between the Netherlands and the British as part of a peace treaty. And so the Dutch got Suriname, and the Brits got New Amsterdam, which of course became New York. So there you go. Who got the better deal? Yeah, depends. I mean, actually, at the time, Suriname was much more profitable, and the reason it was very profitable was because it was exploited as a slave-based economy of plantations. So the classic kind of Caribbean mix of sugar, coffee, cocoa, cotton, all being grown at great profit entirely through the labour of people from West Africa brought over to work there. Now, this author, Cynthia MacLeod, you would perhaps think from her name that she was like British or Scottish or something. Absolutely not. She's Afro-Surinamese, and interestingly, actually the daughter of the first president of independent Suriname. And she obviously is fascinated by her own country's history. She's done lots of research. She's kind of gone to the archives. And in writing this book, which was published I think in 1987, you can tell that her aim was to take some of the history of her country and retell it in kind of delightful, popular historical fiction for people in Suriname, and it was published in Suriname. Then it became a bit of a hit in the Netherlands because it was written in Dutch, and then eventually became translated into various other languages, including English, which is what the version I've read. And the translator, I always like to mention the translator, was Gerald Mettam, and I think he did a fairly good job. It's hard to tell, like, the one thing that this book really loses in translation, and it's quite significant, is that I think when she originally wrote it, she wrote it predominantly in Dutch, but also partially in a language called Suriname, which is a Creole language that's also was used historically in Suriname and still is used to this day. And that was the language that the slaves used. They sort of developed, that was that kind of based on English with a lot of majority of Dutch vocabulary, but a bit of Portuguese, and then words from various West African languages. So, you know, they needed a common language to use, and that's the one they developed. And then that also became the language that the slave owners and the slaves used to communicate with each other. So all the dialogue in the book that involves all the black characters, that's in Suriname. Obviously, then it's translated into English. It's all in English. It's as if they're all speaking the same. But fortunately, that is in the footnotes, and you can kind of go and read that, which is quite intriguing because you can almost understand it, as sometimes you can with like Creole languages, because they're almost kind of, they're made as languages for mutual communication between people who spoke different things, if that makes sense. Anyway, that's one of the little interesting kind of nuggets, I suppose, in the book that you learn, and her readers in Suriname would have no trouble understanding that, because it's still widely used alongside Dutch. Now, the period of Suriname's history that she puts into this book is the 18th century, so golden age for the plantations. Now, it's interesting because she chooses to make the main characters from plantation owning families. So there's lots of black characters, slaves, and free blacks, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But the main protagonists are from a particular community, though, that she obviously found quite intriguing, which is the Jewish community in Suriname. Who knew there was a Jewish community in Suriname in the 17th and 18th century? They were there almost before the Dutch. They're like Portuguese and Spanish Jews that came to Suriname to escape kind of persecution in Europe, and were allowed by the British to settle there, and they set up plantations, and the first synagogue in South America was in Suriname. There you go. So obviously she was intrigued by that community, and I don't know whether any of her ancestors are from that community, because, you know, at this point most people in Suriname are kind of like a fascinating mixture. Certainly it's interesting because by the time the book's written in the 18th century, although they'd been founders almost of the sort of white colonization in Suriname, they were by then very much becoming looked down upon by the sort of newer Dutch settlers. So this whole kind of layer upon layer of in the sort of Surinamese society at that point. Another chunk of the people in Suriname at that point that she really wants to tell us about in this book, and does, are the Maroons. Now, because Suriname is kind of, is not an island, and so, you know, it's like on the South American mainland and has a hinterland of rainforest. there was a lot of successful escape by the slaves in Suriname, and British Ghana and French Ghana, they could run away into the rainforest, and they interacted with the American indigenous people that lived there, and formed like a whole new culture and community that was commonly referred to as the Maroons, but they successfully ran their own kind of society alongside the plantation society, and raided it, and there were wars between the Maroons and the Dutch, and treaties, and they eventually kind of managed to establish that they should have kind of autonomous control over their sort of areas. Really interesting, and she kind of almost idealizes that a little. No, not idealizes. She wants us to appreciate what an achievement that was, I suppose. She also wants us to understand the brutality of slavery in Suriname, and slave owners in Suriname were notorious even in their day for their brutality, and you know, even compared with other you know, with the rest of the Caribbean. And so that's saying something, isn't it? And she kind of builds that all into this novel. She also builds in the fact that there were relationships between kind of white Surinamese and black Surinamese at the time that were brutal, exploitative, and you know, the endemic rape of slave women, but also that there were kind of like consensual and loving relationships, and it's kind of, I suppose she really sets out to give you all those different layers, and that's one of the pleasures of this book. And I know she's written another book about a woman called Elizabeth Sampson that she kind of really researched, who was a free black woman in Suriname in the 18th century, who became like probably the wealthiest woman in Suriname. She was a slave owner herself, including some of her own family. What an interesting character. I would really like to read that novel. But she ultimately, with some difficulty, eventually won the right to marry her white lover, which had otherwise been illegal. So there we go. Fascinating stuff. You can tell, can't you, that I really enjoyed reading this book. Now, it's not smart literature, this. It's popular historical fiction. Some of the dialogue is really clunky. It has that fault that you get in historical fiction, where the author is so infused by their research, by the topic, that they want to share all of that with you, and in order to do that, they get their characters to kind of give a load of exposition rather than, you know, just letting the story flow. There's one thing that I kind of had a bit of a problem with in the book, which was the two main characters. One of them is kind of does the right thing, and she's sort of seen as like the nice girl, they're stepsisters, the nice girl, and then there's the bad girl who's like sexually active and suffers as a result, you know. And as a storyline, that I have to say is not my favourite. Okay, putting that aside, great fun. You can romp through this. You'll learn loads about Suriname that you didn't know, and have a happy time. And yeah, so it's a thumbs up. It's a recommend. Yeah.